The most dangerous moment in your faith is not when God says no. It is when he says nothing. No confirmation, no sign, no feeling. No answer to the prayer you have been carrying for weeks, months, years. Just silence, heavy and unbroken. And something inside you begins to ask the question you are afraid to say aloud. Is anyone actually there? If that question has ever crossed your mind, stay with this. Because what you have been told about God's silence may be the very thing keeping you from understanding it. And what you are about to hear may be the most important reframe you have ever encountered about the season you are living in right now. Most people, when the silence arrives, assume the story is ending. But what if the silence is exactly where the story begins to turn? Every person who has ever taken faith seriously eventually arrives at this place, the place where heaven goes quiet, where the presence that once felt undeniable begins to feel uncertain, where you pray and the words seem to dissolve before they reach anything. And the instinct, the immediate, almost involuntary human instinct, is to panic, to assume something has gone wrong, to conclude that the silence is evidence of absence, that God has moved, that God has turned away, that you have somehow been left behind. But this is where things become stranger, because the people who experience the most dramatic encounters with God in Scripture also experience the most devastating silences. David, the man described as being after God's own heart, wrote entire psalms from inside an absence so complete it felt like abandonment. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? That is not the language of someone who hasn't been paying attention. That is the language of someone who knows exactly what the presence felt like, and is now living inside the absence of it. Job called out from the ruins of his life and received nothing but silence for chapters upon chapters. Elijah, fresh from one of the most dramatic miracles recorded in the entire Old Testament, collapsed under a tree and begged to die, overwhelmed, exhausted, feeling entirely alone, not because he had wandered from God, but because he was human and the silence had become unbearable. If God's silence only came to people who had done something wrong, why did it find them? What if silence isn't the problem? What if we have fundamentally misread what the silence means? For centuries, people have assumed that divine silence equals divine distance, that when God speaks, he is near, and when he is quiet, he has withdrawn. Yet almost nobody notices the pattern hiding inside the most painful stories in Scripture. Joseph is sold into slavery by his own brothers, then falsely accused, then thrown into an Egyptian prison, year after year in that cell. No angelic visitation recorded, no dramatic intervention, no voice from heaven explaining what is happening or why. Just a locked door and silence. And then, without announcement, the prison opens and he is standing before Pharaoh. And everything the silence was quietly holding begins to move at once. David spent years running from Saul through wilderness and caves. He had been anointed king as a teenager. He waited decades before a single element of that promise materialized. Abraham waited so long for the child, he was promised that the possibility became biologically absurd. And then there is the one that none of us would have survived watching. 3 days. A sealed tomb. Complete silence. Every promise apparently buried under stone. Every hope the disciples had built their lives around seemingly finished. And on the other side of that silence, everything changed. The pattern is not hidden once you begin looking for it. God does not appear to be most active when everything is loud and moving and visible. His deepest work seems to happen inside the silence that looks exactly like nothing. Silence and inactivity are not the same thing. They have never been the same thing. What looks like God doing nothing may be God doing something that cannot yet be seen. Something being built beneath the surface, in the dark, before it is ready to emerge. But God's silence is not only about preparation. Sometimes it reveals something far more uncomfortable, something about the person waiting inside it. Silence does something that noise cannot. It exposes what was always there beneath the surface. When God is speaking clearly, when the confirmation comes easily, when the feeling of presence is strong, faith feels effortless. It costs almost nothing, because it is being carried by experience rather than by genuine conviction. But when the silence arrives, when the feeling disappears and the confirmation stops and prayer begins to feel like speaking into an empty room, what remains? Do you trust God? Or do you trust the feeling of God? Because those are not the same thing, and most people have never been forced to discover which one they actually have. The silence reveals whether your faith is rooted in the character of God, in what you know to be true about who He is, or whether it is rooted in sensation, in emotional warmth, in the constant reassurance that you need before you can keep moving, in the feeling of being held rather than the knowledge that you are. Silence exposes what noise was hiding. That is not comfortable, but it may be the most honest thing that has ever happened to your faith. Has your faith become dependent on feelings? Do you only trust God when you can sense Him moving? Do you need constant confirmation before you will take the next step? The silence is not asking these questions to condemn you. It is asking them because the answers reveal the true foundation of everything you have built, because a faith that only functions when it can be felt is not yet the kind of faith that will carry you through everything still ahead. If silence is preparation, and if silence is exposure, then what are you supposed to actually do while you are living inside it? The first thing, and perhaps the hardest, is to remember what God already said. Not what He is saying right now. What He said before the silence came, before the confusion arrived, before the circumstances made everything feel uncertain. The silence does not erase what was already spoken. It only makes it harder to hear. David did not stop writing psalms in the wilderness. He wrote them from inside the silence, returning again and again to what he knew about who God was, even when he could not feel it. I will bless the Lord at all times. Not when He speaks. Not when I can feel His presence. At all times, including this one. The second thing is to stop demanding a sign before you take the next step, because the silence will not always break before you are asked to move. Sometimes the confirmation comes after obedience, not before it. Sometimes the next step is taken in complete darkness, not because faith is absent, but because faith is precisely what moves in the dark. Waiting for perfect clarity before moving is not wisdom. Sometimes it is the silence asking whether you trust the one who called you, or only the conditions in which He called you. And the third thing is perhaps the most confronting. Stop interpreting God through your circumstances alone, because the circumstances of Joseph in a prison cell looked like abandonment. They were preparation for a throne. The circumstances of a sealed tomb looked like the end of every promise. They were the middle of the most important story ever told. Your circumstances are not the full story. They are one frame of a film you have not finished watching yet. The greatest mistake made inside the silence is assuming that quiet means gone, that stillness means stopped, that the absence of sensation means the absence of presence. Scripture tells a different story in every chapter, willing to be honest about this. The same God who seemed silent in the prison was preparing a throne for the man rotting inside it. The same God who seemed silent in the wilderness was shaping a king from the boy hiding in caves. The same God who seemed silent at the cross was doing in 3 days what no one watching believed was still possible. The silence was never the absence of the story. It was where the story was being written. And for whoever is sitting inside a silence right now, that may be the only thing worth holding on to. Not the feeling, not the sign, not the confirmation that has not yet come, but the character of a God who has been silent before and has never once allowed the silence to be the end. Maybe heaven feels quiet right now. Maybe the prayer feels unanswered and the path ahead feels completely dark. But silence has never been his final word. It has only ever been the space before it.